Imagine walking into a grocery store, your mind focused on the simple task of picking up ingredients for dinner. The hum of the fluorescent lights overhead, the sound of shopping carts rolling, and the soft chatter of other customers form a familiar backdrop. You're thinking about your day, your plans, and maybe even what show to watch later tonight. You're in your own world, just like any other day. But then, something shifts. You notice eyes on you, watching, judging. You feel the weight of their stares, a tension in the air that wasn't there before. What would you do if, in a single moment, everything changed? If, suddenly, you were surrounded by police, accused of something you didn't do, simply because of the color of your skin or the way you looked? What if, in that moment, something inside you awakened, something powerful, something uncontrollable? Would you run? Would you fight? And what if this power you never asked for suddenly made you a target, not just for the police, but for forces far more dangerous? This is exactly where Amara Williams found herself one ordinary afternoon, a trip to the grocery store that turned into something extraordinary, a moment that would change her life forever. Surrounded by fear and prejudice, Amara discovers she possesses a power she never knew she had, a power that could either save her or destroy her. But what would you do if you suddenly realized the world wasn't ready for who you truly are? Would you hide, or would you stand and fight? As the world watched, Amara had to make a choice, and it was a choice that would lead her down a path she never imagined. Join us as we explore Amara's journey, a story of fear, power, and the struggle to be seen in a world that wants to erase you. Chapter 1: The Grocery Store Incident. The fluorescent lights flickered erratically above the aisles of the local grocery store, casting an eerie, sterile glow over the rows of canned goods and cereal boxes. It was a typical Tuesday afternoon, and the store was relatively quiet, the hum of the refrigerators the only sound filling the void. At the center of the store stood Amara Williams, a young black woman in her mid-20s, with long, braided hair that cascaded down her back like a waterfall. She was dressed casually in a faded denim jacket and a pair of comfortable jeans, her expression focused as she scanned the list on her phone. She was just like any other shopper here, but today was far from ordinary. She could feel the stares from the moment she walked in. The subtle shift in energy, the way people clutched their bags just a little tighter, or quickly glanced away when she met their gaze. Amara was used to it, the constant undercurrent of racism that flowed through her daily life like a poisonous river. But today, something felt different. The air was charged, almost electric, and it prickled at her skin. She ignored it, moving down the aisle to pick up a jar of pasta sauce. She had dinner to make for her little brother, Marcus, and she wouldn't let the weight of a few stares break her stride. As she turned the corner into the next aisle, she noticed a commotion near the entrance. 4 police officers had entered the store, their eyes scanning the aisles with a sharp intensity. She watched as they spoke briefly to the store manager, a portly man with a nervous demeanor who kept glancing in her direction. Amara felt a cold chill run down her spine, a deep-rooted instinct that warned her something was very wrong. Suddenly, the officers were walking towards her, their expressions stern and unyielding. She felt her pulse quicken, her breath hitching in her throat as she clutched her shopping basket a little tighter. "Ma'am, we need to talk to you," one of the officers said, his voice low but firm. Amara glanced around, her eyes wide, trying to understand what was happening. "Is there a problem, officer?" she asked, keeping her voice calm and measured, though her heart was racing. "We received a report that you were acting suspiciously," another officer added, his hand resting on his holstered weapon. "We're going to need you to come with us." Amara's mind raced. She had done nothing wrong. She had just walked into the store like any other person. Suspicious? What are you talking about? "I'm just shopping," she said, her voice tinged with disbelief. But before she could say another word, one of the officers reached out to grab her arm. Instinctively, she pulled back, her eyes blazing with defiance. "Don't touch me," she shouted, her voice echoing through the aisles. The tension in the store snapped like a taut wire, and suddenly, everyone was watching. Phones were raised, recording the scene as it unfolded. The officer's grip tightened, and Amara felt a surge of something deep within her, an anger, a power that she had never felt before. Her vision blurred, and when it cleared, everything seemed sharper, more vivid. She could see the beads of sweat on the officer's brow, the trembling hands of the customers, the fear in their eyes. And then, without warning, her own eyes began to burn. A searing heat spread across her face, and she gasped, stumbling back as a wave of energy coursed through her. The officers froze, their expressions shifting from anger to confusion, then to fear. Amara's eyes glowed a brilliant, unnatural red, like two burning coals set in her face. She could feel the heat radiating from them, could see the way the officers recoiled, unsure of what they were witnessing. "Back off," she shouted, her voice resonating with an otherworldly power that was not her own. The officers hesitated, their hands hovering over their weapons, unsure of what to do. Amara's heart was pounding, her breaths coming in rapid, shallow gasps. She didn't know what was happening to her, but she knew she had to get out of there, now. Chapter 2. The awakening. Amara burst through the doors of the grocery store, her eyes still blazing like molten fire. The crowd outside scattered as she emerged, people scrambling to get away from the strange and terrifying sight. She could feel the fear emanating from them, could hear the whispers of witch, demon, and monster as she passed. Tears stung her eyes, mixing with the heat and making her vision blur again. She ran, her feet pounding against the pavement, not knowing where she was going, only that she needed to escape. She could hear the sirens in the distance, the screeching of tires as more police cars arrived on the scene. She darted down an alley, her breath ragged, her body trembling with adrenaline and fear. She ducked behind a dumpster, crouching low as she tried to catch her breath. Her hands were shaking, and she felt a deep, primal fear clawing at her insides. What was happening to her? As she sat there, hidden in the shadows, she tried to make sense of it all. The glowing eyes, the surge of power, none of it made any sense. She had never experienced anything like this before. She closed her eyes, willing herself to calm down, to push the fear aside. She needed to think, to figure out what to do next. Suddenly, a voice broke through the chaos in her mind. "Amara, are you okay?" It was soft, soothing, yet filled with concern. She opened her eyes and saw a figure standing in the shadows, a man with a kind face and piercing blue eyes. He was dressed in a long, dark coat, his hands raised in a gesture of peace. "Who are you?" Amara demanded, her voice trembling as she tried to summon the strength she had felt moments before. Her eyes still burned, but the intensity was fading. "My name is Elijah," the man said gently. "I'm here to help you." "Help me? How do you know my name?" "What's happening to me?" she asked, her voice rising with desperation. She didn't trust him, how could she? But there was something in his eyes, a sincerity that made her pause. "I know this is confusing," Elijah continued, taking a cautious step forward. "But you have to believe me, Amara. What you're experiencing is something that has been inside you all along, a power that's been dormant, waiting to awaken." Amara stared at him, her mind spinning. Power? This was some kind of power? "You're insane," she muttered, backing away. "I'm not some freak with powers." Elijah shook his head. "No, you're not a freak. You're special, Amara. And right now, the police think you're dangerous. You need to come with me if you want to survive." Chapter 3. Uncovering the truth. Amara didn't know why, but something deep within her told her to trust Elijah. Maybe it was the sincerity in his eyes, or maybe it was just the desperate need for answers. She nodded, slowly lowering her guard. "Fine. But if this is some kind of trick, it's not," Elijah assured her. "Follow me." He led her through a series of back alleys and side streets, away from the chaos of the grocery store. Amara kept her eyes on him, wary but curious. She could hear the sirens fading in the distance, but she knew it was only a matter of time before they found her again. After what felt like an eternity, they arrived at a small, run-down building at the edge of town. Elijah opened the door, gesturing for her to enter. Inside, the space was dimly lit and cluttered with books, strange artifacts, and maps pinned to the walls. It looked like a cross between a library and a conspiracy theorist's lair. Amara glanced around, taking it all in, her mind buzzing with questions. "What is this place?" she asked, turning to Elijah. "This is my sanctuary," he replied, closing the door behind them. A safe place for people like you. People like me? Amara echoed, still trying to wrap her head around everything. You keep saying that, but I don't even know what that means. Elijah nodded, understanding her confusion. You have a gift, Amara. A rare and powerful ability that has been suppressed for most of your life. The glow in your eyes, the surge of energy you felt, that was your power awakening. It's called the Crimson Sight, an ancient and mystical force passed down through generations. Amara blinked, her mind struggling to process his words. Crimson Sight? You mean like some kind of magic? Yes, but it's more than just magic. It's a force that allows you to see the truth in people's souls, to feel their emotions, their intentions. And, in extreme cases, it can manifest in ways that are quite formidable, Elijah explained. It's why the police were so frightened. They felt it. Amara felt a shiver run down her spine. So, what do I do now? I didn't ask for this power. I don't even know how to control it. That's why I'm here, Elijah said, his tone reassuring. I can help you learn to control it, to understand it. But first, you need to understand the history of your gift, and why it's so important. He led her to a large, dusty book on a nearby table, opening it to a page filled with intricate drawings and symbols. The Crimson Sight is a power that has been hunted for centuries, he began, his voice low and serious. There are those who would do anything to harness it for their own ends. That's why it's crucial that you learn to control it before it controls you. Amara stared at the pages, her heart pounding. She had been thrust into a world she never knew existed, with dangers she couldn't even begin to understand. But one thing was clear, there was no going back. Chapter 4. The training begins. The days that followed were a whirlwind of learning, frustration, and discovery. Elijah taught Amara how to channel her emotions, how to focus the energy of the Crimson Sight, and how to control the fiery glow in her eyes. It wasn't easy. The power was unpredictable, tied directly to her emotions, and any slip could cause a surge of uncontrollable energy. Amara practiced day and night, her body and mind growing weary, but she refused to give up. She could feel the power within her, a burning force that pulsed with every beat of her heart. She knew that if she could master it, she could protect herself, and maybe even fight back against the racism and injustice that had plagued her life. Elijah was a patient teacher, but he pushed her hard, knowing that time was running out. The police were still looking for her, and rumors were spreading. There were whispers of a dangerous woman with glowing red eyes, and fear was spreading through the city like wildfire. You're doing well, Amara, Elijah said one evening after a particularly intense training session. But there's still much to learn. Your power is growing stronger every day, and with it, the danger increases. We need to be prepared for whatever comes next. Amara nodded, wiping the sweat from her brow. I'm ready, she said, her voice filled with determination. Whatever it takes, I'm ready. Chapter 5. The confrontation. It wasn't long before the inevitable happened. The police, along with a group of mysterious agents dressed in black suits, tracked them down to Elijah's sanctuary. They arrived under the cover of darkness, their vehicles surrounding the building like predators closing in on their prey. Amara and Elijah stood side by side, watching as the armed men approached. This is it, Elijah whispered. Remember what I taught you. Stay calm, stay focused, and trust in your power. Amara's heart was pounding, but she nodded, her eyes already beginning to glow. She could feel the energy building inside her, a storm waiting to be unleashed. She took a deep breath, centering herself, and then stepped forward to face their enemies. Amara Williams, one of the agents, called out, his voice amplified by a megaphone. You are under arrest. Surrender now, and no one will get hurt. Amara felt a surge of anger, but she pushed it down, focusing instead on the calm center that Elijah had taught her to find. I'm not going anywhere, she replied, her voice steady. I haven't done anything wrong. The agent's face twisted with frustration. You're a threat, and you need to be contained. This is your last warning. Amara could feel the tension in the air, the fear and the hatred radiating from the men surrounding her. She closed her eyes, letting the power of the Crimson Sight flow through her. When she opened them again, her eyes burned brighter than ever, casting an eerie red glow across the dark street. "Then come and get me," she said, her voice resonating with power, and with that, the battle began. Chapter 6, Rise of the Crimson Warrior. The clash was violent and chaotic. The police and agents charged, their weapons drawn, but Amara was ready. She moved with a fluid grace, her eyes blazing like twin suns. She could see their movements before they even made them, could feel their intentions like a pulse beneath her skin. She dodged and weaved through their attacks, her hands glowing with energy as she deflected their blows. Elijah fought beside her, his own abilities manifesting in flashes of light and shadow. Together, they were a force to be reckoned with, but the enemy was relentless. More and more agents poured in, their numbers overwhelming. Amara's strength was waning, her body growing tired from the constant exertion. She could feel the power of the crimson sight slipping from her grasp, the glow in her eyes flickering like a dying flame. She needed to end this, and fast. Summoning every ounce of strength she had left, Amara let out a powerful scream, unleashing a wave of energy that sent the agents flying back. The ground shook, and the air crackled with power. The remaining men hesitated, fear in their eyes as they stared at her, unsure if they wanted to continue the fight. "This is your last chance," Amara said, her voice echoing with authority. "Leave now, and never come back." The agents exchanged nervous glances, and slowly, one by one, they began to retreat, dragging their unconscious comrades with them. Within minutes, the street was empty, the danger gone. Amara collapsed to her knees, her body trembling with exhaustion. Elijah rushed to her side, helping her up. "You did it," he said, his voice filled with pride. "You've mastered your power." Amara nodded weakly, a small smile on her lips. "I guess I have," she whispered. "But this isn't over, is it?" Elijah shook his head. "No, it's just beginning. But now, you're ready for whatever comes next." Chapter 7, A New Beginning. In the days that followed, Amara became a symbol of resistance and strength. News of her abilities spread, and she became a beacon of hope for those who had suffered from injustice and oppression. She knew there would always be those who would fear her, who would try to control or destroy her. But she also knew that she had the power to fight back, to stand up for herself and for others. Elijah stayed by her side, guiding her as she continued to learn and grow. Together, they formed a small but powerful group of allies, people with abilities like hers who were tired of hiding, tired of living in fear. They vowed to protect each other, to fight for justice, and to stand against the forces that sought to oppress them. Amara looked out over the city, her eyes still glowing softly in the fading light. She knew the road ahead would be long and difficult, but she was ready. She was no longer just a woman running from her power, she was a warrior, a force to be reckoned with, and as she stood there, the wind blowing through her braids, she knew one thing for certain: she would never back down again. Chapter 8, The Gathering Storm. As news of the Crimson Woman spread like wildfire across the city, it didn't take long for others with unique abilities to come out of hiding. Some were drawn to Amara out of curiosity, others out of fear. But there were those who saw her as a beacon of hope, a symbol of resistance against the oppressive forces that had controlled them for so long. Amara and Elijah's small sanctuary quickly became a gathering point for those who wanted to join their cause. Within weeks, the once quiet, dusty room was filled with a diverse group of individuals, men and women, young and old, each with their own stories of oppression, fear, and survival. Some had been hunted by the same mysterious agents who had come after Amara. Others had lost loved ones, or spent years hiding their true selves from a world that would never accept them. One of the first to arrive was Kira, a soft-spoken woman with the ability to manipulate shadows. She had lived her entire life in the dark corners of the city, using her powers to hide from those who would harm her. She spoke little, but when she did, her words were filled with a quiet intensity that commanded attention. Then there was Malik, a former police officer who had turned his back on the force after witnessing too many acts of injustice. He possessed the power of enhanced strength and reflexes, and he had vowed to use his abilities to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. His presence brought a sense of discipline and strategy to the group, and his insight into the police and their tactics proved invaluable. And there was Ravi, a young man with a mischievous smile and a knack for technology. He could manipulate electronic devices with a mere thought, a skill that made him indispensable when it came to surveillance and communication. He had grown up on the streets, using his powers to survive, but he saw in Amara a chance to be part of something bigger, something meaningful. As more and more people joined their cause, Amara found herself stepping into a role she had never imagined: leader. She had always been strong-willed, a fighter, but now she was something more. She was a symbol, a voice for the voiceless, and with that came a heavy burden of responsibility. Each night, after the training sessions and strategy meetings, Amara would sit alone in the dimly lit sanctuary, reflecting on the journey that had brought her here. She had never asked for this power, had never wanted to be anything more than a normal young woman living her life in peace. But now, with everything that had happened, she couldn't turn back. She had to keep moving forward, for herself, for those who had joined her, and for those who still lived in fear. "Are you okay?" Elijah's voice broke through her thoughts one evening as he sat down beside her. He had been watching her closely these past weeks, sensing the weight she carried on her shoulders. "I'm fine," she replied, though she knew he could see through the lie. "Just thinking." "You're doing great, Elijah said softly. "You brought all these people together, given them hope. That's not something everyone can do." Amara sighed, her eyes still glowing faintly in the dim light. "I just don't want to let them down," she admitted. "They're all looking to me for answers, for guidance, and I'm not sure I have all the answers." "You don't have to have all the answers," Elijah said gently. "You just have to keep moving forward, one step at a time. Trust yourself, and trust in the people who believe in you." Amara nodded, a small smile tugging at her lips. "Thanks, Elijah. For everything. We're in this together, remember," he replied with a grin. "And we've got a long road ahead of us." As they sat there in the quiet of the sanctuary, the first light of dawn beginning to filter through the cracked windows, Amara felt a renewed sense of purpose. She wasn't alone in this fight, and as long as she had people like Elijah and the others by her side, she knew they could face whatever came next. But little did they know, a new threat was looming on the horizon, one that would test their strength, their unity, and their resolve like never before. Chapter 9, The Shadow Organization. Far from the city, in a fortified compound hidden deep within a forest, a group of men and women sat around a long table in a dimly lit room. They were dressed in dark suits, their faces partially obscured by shadows. At the head of the table sat a man with a cold, calculating gaze. His name was Director Sterling, and he was the leader of a covert government organization known as the Vanguard, a group dedicated to controlling and weaponizing individuals with supernatural abilities. "The situation is escalating," Sterling said, his voice a low growl that commanded attention. "The Crimson Woman has become a rallying point for others like her. If we don't act now, we risk a full-scale uprising." A woman to his right, Agent Parker, nodded in agreement. "We've identified at least a dozen individuals who have joined her group, each with unique abilities. Our intelligence suggests they're planning some kind of coordinated action, but we don't yet know what." Sterling leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled under his chin. "We can't afford to wait. We need to move in and neutralize the threat before it grows any further." "But the public is watching," another agent interjected. "If we make a move now, it could turn them against us. We need to be strategic." Sterling's eyes narrowed, a dangerous glint in them. "Then we'll make it look like an accident. We'll use fear to turn the public against them, to paint them as the villains in this story." Agent Parker nodded. "I have a team ready. We can infiltrate their ranks, gain their trust, and strike from within. Once we have their leader, the rest will fall in line." "Good," Sterling said, a sinister smile spreading across his lips. "Make it happen." Chapter 10, The Betrayal. Back at the sanctuary, things were moving quickly. Amara and her group were growing stronger, more organized. Malik had been training them in combat tactics, while Ravi set up a network of surveillance to monitor police movements and potential threats. Kiera's ability to manipulate shadows allowed them to remain hidden from prying eyes, at least for now, but amidst the camaraderie and determination, there was a simmering tension. Malik had grown particularly close to a new recruit, a woman named Nadia, who claimed to have the ability to read and manipulate emotions. She was charming, confident, and seemed to know exactly what to say to win people over. But there was something about her that Amara couldn't quite place, a feeling in her gut that told her not to trust her. Elijah, she said one evening, pulling him aside. I don't know about Nadia. She's too perfect, too smooth. I think we need to keep an eye on her. Elijah nodded, his brow furrowed. I've noticed it too. She's been asking a lot of questions about our plans, about you. I'll keep an eye on her. But by the time they realized the truth, it was too late. One night, while everyone was gathered for a strategy meeting, the sanctuary was suddenly surrounded. Nadia had betrayed them, feeding information to the vanguard and leading them right to their doorstep. The assault was swift and brutal. Agents in black suits flooded the building, armed with high-tech weapons designed to neutralize their abilities. Panic erupted as Amara and her allies fought back, but they were outnumbered and outgunned. Nadia! Amara shouted as she saw her standing beside a group of agents, a smug smile on her face. You traitor! Nadia's smile only widened. You should have trusted your instincts, Amara. But don't worry, I'll make sure they go easy on you. Fury and betrayal surged through Amara, and she felt the crimson sight flare to life within her. Her eyes blazed like twin stars, and a wave of energy exploded from her, knocking several agents off their feet. Get everyone out. Elijah shouted, throwing up a barrier of light to hold back the agents. We can't win this fight here. Amara nodded, her heart pounding as she channeled her energy to hold off the attackers. One by one, her allies began to slip away, using the chaos as cover to escape. But as she turned to leave, she saw Malik struggling with an agent, a look of pain and betrayal on his face. Malik, she called out, rushing to his side. We have to go. He nodded, but as they turned to flee, a shot rang out. Malik stumbled, clutching his side, blood seeping through his fingers. Go, he gasped. I'll hold them off. No. Amara screamed, her eyes blazing brighter than ever. She reached out, grabbing him and pulling him away. I'm not leaving you behind. Together, they fled into the night, leaving the burning sanctuary behind. The vanguard had won this battle, but Amara knew the war was far from over. Chapter 11, the regroup. Amara and the surviving members of her group managed to find temporary refuge in an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city. They were battered and broken, but not defeated. Malik's wound was serious, and they had to work quickly to patch him up. He lay on a makeshift bed, his face pale, but his eyes still burning with determination. I'm sorry, he muttered as Amara knelt beside him. I should have seen it coming. I should have, Shoo, Amara said softly, squeezing his hand. You did your best. We all did. We're going to get through this. But she knew their situation was dire. They had lost their sanctuary, their home. The vanguard was closing in, and they were running out of time and options. We need to figure out our next move, Elijah said, pacing back and forth. They'll be hunting us down, and we can't stay here for long. Amara nodded, her mind racing. She felt the weight of leadership bearing down on her more than ever. We need to hit them where it hurts, she said, a plan forming in her mind. If we can take out Sterling, we can cut the head off the snake. Kiera, who had been listening quietly, spoke up. I know someone who can help. A hacker who goes by the name Spectre. They've been fighting against the vanguard for years, exposing their secrets. If anyone can get us the information we need on Sterling, it's them. Do it, Amara said without hesitation. We need all the help we can get. And so, the next phase of their fight began. Amara knew they were walking a razor's edge, but she was more determined than ever. She had seen the darkness that lay within the hearts of those who sought to control them, and she would do whatever it took to ensure that her people would never have to live in fear again. Chapter 12, the infiltration. With Kiera's contact established, Amara and her team quickly connected with Spectre, who agreed to help in exchange for protection from the vanguard. Spectre, a young, rebellious hacker who lived off the grid, had a personal vendetta against the organization. Her family had been torn apart by one of their containment operations, and she had spent years using her skills to expose their corrupt practices and human rights abuses. Spectre's safe house became their new base of operations. It was a small, cluttered space filled with computer monitors, wires, and blinking servers. Spectre herself was a fierce-looking woman with cropped hair and a piercing gaze, her fingers constantly tapping away on her keyboard. "We've got a short window to make this work," she said, her voice tinged with urgency. "Sterling's got a fortress of security around him, but I've managed to find a vulnerability in their system. If we can get close enough, I can give you access to their mainframe and you can take him down from the inside." Amara listened carefully, her expression serious. "And how do we get close enough without getting caught?" "That's the tricky part," Spectre admitted. "They'll be expecting a frontal assault, but if we create a diversion, we might be able to slip in unnoticed." Elijah nodded. "I'll handle the diversion. Kira and I can use our abilities to draw their attention while Amara, Malik, and Ravi infiltrate the facility." The plan was risky, and the odds were against them, but they had no choice. It was now or never. The night of the operation was tense. They moved under the cover of darkness, splitting into two groups. Elijah and Kira headed toward the front gates, their abilities cloaking them in shadows. Meanwhile, Amara, Malik, and Ravi made their way through the dense forest surrounding the Vanguard's compound, their breaths shallow as they crept closer to their target. When they were within range, Spectre's voice crackled through their earpieces. "Okay, you're in position. Wait for my signal." A few moments later, a deafening explosion echoed through the night, followed by the sound of alarms blaring. Elijah and Kira had done their part, creating a massive distraction that drew the guards and agents away from the facility's main entrance. "Go, go, go." Spectre's voice urged, and Amara, Malik, and Ravi moved swiftly toward the compound. They slipped through the gates and made their way to the central building, their hearts pounding as they raced against time. Inside, they moved like shadows, avoiding patrols and security cameras with Ravi's guidance. They reached the mainframe room, where Spectre's hacking skills had disabled the electronic locks. Amara took a deep breath, her eyes glowing faintly as she steeled herself for what was to come. "All right, we're in," she whispered. "Let's do this." Chapter 13. The showdown. The room was dimly lit, with rows of servers lining the walls. Amara could hear the hum of machines and the faint chatter of radio communications from the guards outside. She knew they had only minutes before the entire compound would be on high alert again. Ravi quickly went to work, connecting his portable device to the mainframe. "Spectre, I need access codes now," he muttered under his breath, working on it. "Got it," Spectre replied. "Uploading now. You should see the terminal unlocking. Now." As the screen flickered to life, Amara's pulse quickened. She knew they were moments away from finding out everything they needed to know about Sterling and his operation. But just as the data began to flow, a loud clang echoed through the room. The door behind them burst open, and Sterling himself walked in, flanked by a dozen heavily armed agents. Well, Sterling sneered, his cold eyes locking onto Amara. "The Crimson Woman. I must say, I'm impressed. You've managed to survive longer than I expected." Amara's eyes blazed with fury as she stepped forward, her stance defiant. "Your days of terrorizing people like me are over, Sterling. You're going to pay for what you've done." Sterling chuckled, a sinister smile playing across his lips. "You think you can stop me? You're nothing but a child playing with fire." With a flick of his wrist, the agents raised their weapons, aiming them directly at Amara and her friends. "Surrender now, and I might consider sparing your lives." Amara felt the familiar surge of power within her, but this time it was different. It was stronger, more focused. She could feel the rage, the pain, and the determination of everyone who had ever suffered at the hands of the Vanguard, and she channeled it into a single, powerful thought. "No," she said, her voice steady and commanding. "This ends now." With a blinding flash of crimson light, she unleashed a wave of energy that tore through the room, knocking the agents off their feet. Sterling staggered back, his expression shifting from smug confidence to shock and fear. "You think you're special?" he shouted, his voice trembling. You think you can stop us? There will always be more of us. More who see you for what you truly are, freaks, abominations. Amara's eyes burned even brighter, and she took a step forward. And there will always be more of us, people who stand against your hate, your cruelty. We're done being afraid. Sterling reached for a concealed weapon, but before he could draw it, Malik lunged forward, tackling him to the ground. The two men struggled, but Malik's enhanced strength gave him the upper hand. He pinned Sterling down, his face twisted with anger. This is for all the lives you've ruined, Malik growled. He raised a fist to strike, but Amara intervened. No, Malik, she said softly. We're better than him. Let him answer for his crimes. Malik hesitated, then nodded, stepping back. Amara turned to the console, where the data continued to flow. We have everything we need, she said, her voice filled with determination. Now, let's get out of here. Chapter 14, a new era with Sterling captured and the evidence of the Vanguard's crimes in their hands. Amara and her allies knew the battle wasn't over, but a new chapter had begun. They released the information to the world, exposing the dark truth behind the organization that had tormented them for so long. The public outrage was swift, and calls for justice echoed across the city and beyond. The Vanguard's influence began to crumble, its leaders arrested, and its facilities dismantled. But Amara knew this was only the beginning. There were still countless others out there like her, like them, who needed a place to call home, a place where they could be safe and free. Together with Elijah, Malik, Kira, Ravi, and Spectre, Amara founded a new community, a sanctuary for those with abilities, a place where they could learn to harness their powers, to use them for good, and to stand up against the forces that sought to oppress them. And so, the Crimson Site became a symbol not just of power, but of hope, of resilience, and of the unyielding spirit of those who refused to be broken. As Amara looked out over the city from their new sanctuary, she knew their journey was far from over. But for the first time in a long time, she felt a sense of peace, a sense of purpose. She had found her place in this world, and she knew that no matter what came next, she was ready to face it, because she was no longer just a girl with glowing eyes. She was a leader, a warrior, and a force of nature. And she would never stop fighting for justice, for freedom, and for the right to be seen. The end.
Part 1. The world he knew. Malcolm had always been a fighter. Born in a small, tight-knit community, he was raised on principles of integrity, respect, and the constant awareness that his skin color made him a target. His mother used to tell him, "Malcolm, the world won't give you anything freely. You'll have to fight for your dignity, every day." Those words rang true from a young age. He experienced his first encounter with racism at the tender age of 8 when a classmate, unprovoked, hurled an insult that stung more than any playground fall ever could. Over the years, these encounters became more frequent. He grew up learning how to navigate an unjust world, suppressing his anger, avoiding confrontations, and always working twice as hard to prove he was as good as, if not better than, anyone else. By the time he reached adulthood, Malcolm had learned to blend in, to wear the mask of calmness, even as indignities piled up, chipping away at his spirit bit by bit. Still, he believed in the law, believed in justice. His father had been a police officer, and despite all the horrors Malcolm had seen, he clung to the belief that people were inherently good. It was this belief that kept him afloat in a world that constantly tried to drown him. Part 2. The incident. It was an ordinary day. Malcolm had finished his shift as a mechanic and was heading home, exhausted but satisfied after a day of hard work. The sun was just beginning to set, casting long shadows on the suburban street as he made his way through his neighborhood. The hum of cicadas filled the air, and the distant laughter of children playing in the park brought a sense of normalcy. He had just reached the corner of Elm and 5th when he saw the patrol car. It was nothing new, police regularly patrolled the area, but something felt off. The car slowed down as it neared him, and he felt the familiar tension creep into his muscles. Malcolm's instincts told him to keep walking, to mind his own business, and yet, he couldn't help but glance at the car. The windows rolled down, revealing 2 officers inside. They looked at him, eyes cold, devoid of warmth or recognition. The younger one, with a shaved head and a sneer, stepped out. "You fit the description," the officer said, his voice carrying the weight of authority, but laced with something darker, something Malcolm had encountered far too many times in his life. "Description?" Malcolm asked, keeping his voice calm. He knew better than to show fear or defiance. "Yeah. Got a report of someone causing trouble around here. Black male, mid-30s, wearing a white shirt. That sound familiar?" Malcolm looked down at his clothes, a white t-shirt stained with grease from the shop, jeans, and worn sneakers. He knew it wasn't him they were looking for. It was never really about finding the right person, was it? "I've been at work all day," Malcolm replied, his voice steady but tense. "I'm just heading home." The other officer, who had stayed in the car until now, stepped out, his hand resting on his holster. "Let's just make sure of that," he said, his voice low. Something inside Malcolm snapped. For years, he had swallowed his pride. For years, he had kept his head down, knowing the cost of standing up to the system. But now, standing under the weight of their gaze, something broke free inside him. He felt the heat rise in his chest, felt his fists clench involuntarily. "You don't have to do this," Malcolm said, taking a deep breath to calm the fire building inside. "I told you, I've been working. You're wasting your time." But they didn't listen. "Hands where I can see them," the first officer barked. Malcolm hesitated for just a second, and in that moment, everything changed. The officers' hands went to their weapons, and the world slowed down. "I'm not going to let this happen," Malcolm whispered to himself, more as a prayer than a statement. But as the officers advanced, the glint of metal in their hands, Malcolm felt a surge of survival instinct he hadn't known was still inside him that he turned, bolting down the street. Part 3, the pursuit. Malcolm's heart pounded in his chest as his feet pounded the pavement. He could hear the heavy footfalls of the officers behind him, the shouts of "Stop" and "Get down," ringing in his ears, but he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. Years of fear, anger, and injustice propelled him forward. This wasn't just a chase, this was about survival. Malcolm knew the odds. He'd seen the news stories, heard about what happened to men who looked like him in these situations. He wasn't going to be another headline that he darted down an alley, the familiar layout of the neighborhood giving him a momentary advantage. He could hear the officers radioing for backup, but he didn't care. He had to keep moving. His mind raced as he tried to think of a way out. The park, if he could just make it to the park, maybe he'd have a chance, but as Malcolm rounded the corner, he stumbled. His foot caught on a crack in the pavement, and he went down hard, the rough concrete scraping his hands and knees. Pain shot up his leg as he tried to push himself up, but it was too late. The officers were on him. Part 4, the confrontation. "Stay down," one of the officers shouted as they approached, guns drawn. Malcolm struggled to get to his feet, but a sharp pain in his leg kept him grounded. He glanced down and saw blood, a deep gash from where he'd fallen. "Don't move," the second officer yelled, his weapon trained on Malcolm's chest. Malcolm raised his hands, palms facing out, his heart racing. "I didn't do anything," he panted, trying to catch his breath. "I'm just trying to go home." But they didn't hear him. They didn't see him, not the real him. To them, he was just another threat. Another black man who needed to be subdued. The first officer stepped forward, his face twisted in anger. "You think you can run from us?" he snarled, grabbing Malcolm by the collar and yanking him up. Malcolm winced as pain shot through his leg again. "I didn't do anything," he repeated, his voice hoarse, but the officer wasn't listening. He slammed Malcolm against the wall, his face inches away, his breath hot and rancid. "You think we're stupid? You think we won't put you down right here?" Fear gripped Malcolm's chest, but so did something else, defiance. He wasn't going to let them break him. Not again. "I didn't do anything wrong," Malcolm said, his voice steady despite the pain. For a moment, there was silence. The officer stared at him, his eyes burning with hatred. Then, without warning, he swung. The punch connected with Malcolm's jaw, sending him sprawling to the ground. Pain exploded in his head, but he forced himself to stay conscious. He couldn't black out now. Not like this. Part 5, the turning point. As Malcolm lay on the ground, blood trickling from his mouth, something inside him shifted. He had spent his entire life being beaten down by a world that refused to see him as human. He had endured humiliation, degradation, and violence, always believing that if he just kept his head down, if he just played by the rules, he could survive. But survival wasn't enough anymore. Slowly, Malcolm pushed himself up to his knees, his body screaming in protest. His vision was blurry, and his leg throbbed with pain, but he refused to stay down. "I'm not going to let you kill me," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. The officers paused, surprised by the quiet defiance in his words. Malcolm's heart raced, but his mind was clear. This was his stand. This was his fight, and he wasn't going to lose. Part 6, the struggle for dignity. The street was quiet now, the distant sounds of the city fading into the background as Malcolm knelt in the middle of the road. Blood dripped down his leg, pooling on the pavement beneath him, but he didn't care. All he could focus on were the two men standing in front of him, their guns still drawn, their faces twisted in anger and confusion. "I'm done running," Malcolm said, his voice steady despite the pain coursing through his body. "I've been running my whole life, and I'm done." The officers exchanged glances, unsure of what to do next. This wasn't how these things were supposed to go. The suspect was supposed to comply, to beg for mercy, to cower in fear. But Malcolm wasn't doing any of that. "I didn't do anything wrong," Malcolm repeated, his voice gaining strength. "And I'm not going to let you take my dignity from me." One of the officers stepped forward, his face a mask of frustration. "You don't get to decide that," he spat, his hand tightening on his gun. But Malcolm didn't flinch. He met the officer's gaze head-on, his eyes filled with a quiet, unyielding strength. "Yes, I do." And in that moment, something shifted. The tension in the air seemed to break as the officers hesitated, unsure of how to. Epilogue, continued. The seeds of change. Months after the verdict, Malcolm's life transformed into something he never expected. He went from being an ordinary man, simply trying to live his life, to a figure at the center of a growing movement. His once quiet existence as a mechanic had given way to interviews, speeches, and the constant flow of attention from media outlets and activists alike. He had become a reluctant symbol of resistance, not by choice, but by circumstance. The neighborhood that had once been his sanctuary now seemed smaller, as if the world outside had encroached upon it. Every day, people stopped him on the streets, sometimes offering words of support, sometimes simply wanting to shake his hand and express solidarity. But not everyone viewed him as a hero. Some called him a troublemaker, an instigator. They claimed he had made the police look bad, that he had overblown the situation. Even though Malcolm knew the truth, these remarks weighed heavily on him. At night, alone in his small apartment, he often found himself questioning whether he was truly ready for the weight of this new role. After all, he had only wanted to go home that fateful night. Now, home felt like a distant memory, a place lost in the whirlwind of public attention. Yet, deep down, Malcolm understood that his fight was part of something much bigger than himself. This wasn't just about clearing his name or seeking justice for one night's events, it was about confronting an entire system built on inequality and fear. It was about ensuring that others wouldn't have to face the same threats, the same indignities he had faced. Part 9, the community awakens. In the aftermath of Malcolm's case, the city began to change in small but significant ways. Community leaders, inspired by his story, began organizing forums and town halls to address the growing concerns about racial profiling and police violence. Malcolm, though uncomfortable with the attention, attended many of these meetings. He wasn't a politician, wasn't a public speaker, but he knew that his presence meant something to the people who had rallied behind him. At these gatherings, Malcolm shared his experience with raw honesty. He didn't sugarcoat the pain, the humiliation, or the fear he'd felt that night. But he also spoke of the hope that had come from standing up for himself, the dignity he'd reclaimed in the process. His words resonated deeply with those who had experienced similar struggles, but who had never felt empowered to speak up. "We're stronger together," he said at one meeting. "They want us to stay silent, to stay afraid. But if we stand together, if we demand justice, demand our humanity be recognized, then they can't ignore us anymore." Malcolm's message spread, not just in his city, but across the country. Activists and civil rights organizations began to amplify his story, using it as a call to action for broader reforms. His case was cited in news articles, documentaries, and political speeches as a pivotal moment in the ongoing struggle for racial equality. Malcolm, who had once felt alone and overwhelmed, now found himself part of a much larger network of individuals and groups fighting for change. The movement, however, wasn't just about protests and speeches. Concrete steps were being taken. Police departments across the city were pressured to implement new training programs focused on de-escalation and anti-bias practices. Community police relations committees were formed, giving local residents a voice in how their neighborhoods were patrolled. The lawsuit that had once seemed like a personal battle for Malcolm became a catalyst for real, structural change, but change, Malcolm knew, wasn't easy or quick. For every victory, there was resistance. Many in the police department resented the reforms, claiming they were being unfairly targeted. Tensions flared during some of the meetings, and Malcolm often found himself the target of thinly veiled hostility, both from law enforcement and from certain segments of the community who believed he had caused trouble. Yet, through it all, Malcolm stood firm. He had learned a valuable lesson that night, one that stayed with him long after the bruises had healed. Dignity wasn't something given, it was something you had to fight for, every day. And Malcolm was prepared to keep fighting, not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever been made to feel small, voiceless, or powerless. Part 10, A Father's Legacy. Amid all the public turmoil, Malcolm found himself thinking often about his father. His father had been a cop, one of the good ones, as people used to say. But even his father, for all his honor and integrity, had been part of a system that Malcolm now saw as deeply flawed. It was a system that, while capable of great good, was also built on foundations of exclusion, mistrust, and fear. Malcolm remembered the stories his father would tell at the dinner table. Tales of catching bad guys, protecting innocent people, and keeping the peace. As a child, Malcolm had looked up to his father, admiring him for his bravery and sense of duty. But as he grew older, he started to see the cracks in the system his father had so faithfully served. He remembered one conversation in particular, shortly before his father passed away. They had been sitting on the porch, the sun setting on a quiet summer evening. Malcolm, then a teenager, had asked his father if he ever felt conflicted about being a black man in a police force that seemed to target black people. His father had been quiet for a long time before finally speaking. "It's complicated, son," he had said. "I believe in the law. I believe in justice. But sometimes the system doesn't work the way it should. And when that happens, it's up to people like me, and people like you, to try and make it right." At the time, Malcolm hadn't fully understood what his father meant. But now, in the wake of everything that had happened, those words echoed in his mind with new clarity. In many ways, Malcolm realized, his father had been fighting the same battle he was now waging. His father had believed in the potential for change, even from within a system that so often resisted it. And now, it was Malcolm's turn to carry that torch. Part 11, Rebuilding. Brick by brick, as the weeks turned into months, and the months into a year, Malcolm's life began to settle into a new rhythm. The media frenzy died down, and the protests, while still present, became less frequent. The lawsuit he had filed resulted in a substantial settlement, part of which he used to pay for his legal fees and medical bills. But the majority of the money, Malcolm decided, would be put to use for the community. He partnered with local activists and organizations to establish a community center, a safe space for young people, especially those from marginalized communities, to learn, grow, and thrive. The center offered mentorship programs, job training, and educational workshops. But more than that, it provided a place where people could come together, share their experiences, and support one another. Malcolm named the center after his father, the Samuel Carter Justice Center. At the opening ceremony, Malcolm stood before the crowd, feeling a mix of pride and humility. He had come a long way from that night on the street, a night that could have ended so differently. But here he was, not just surviving, but building something lasting, something that would outlive him and continue the fight for justice long after he was gone. As he spoke to the crowd, Malcolm's voice was steady and clear. This center is about more than just resources or programs. It's about community. It's about making sure that every person, no matter where they come from or what they look like, knows that they matter. That their dignity is worth fighting for. The crowd applauded, but Malcolm's mind was already thinking about the future. There was still so much work to be done. But for the first time, he didn't feel overwhelmed. He felt ready. Part 12, the long road ahead. Even as Malcolm found peace in his new role, the world around him continued to evolve. The movement for racial justice, ignited by so many lives lost and stories untold, grew stronger each day. There were setbacks, of course, moments of despair when the system pushed back harder than ever before. But there were also victories, small and large, that fueled the hope for a better future. Malcolm continued to speak, to organize, to push for change. He traveled to other cities, other communities, sharing his story and listening to others. He became a voice for those who couldn't speak, an advocate for those who had been silenced. But through it all, Malcolm never lost sight of the fact that the fight for dignity was not a sprint, it was a marathon. It was a long, winding road, full of challenges and obstacles. But it was a road worth walking, no matter how difficult. And as he looked out at the world he had helped to shape, Malcolm knew one thing for certain: he would keep walking that road. Not just for himself, but for his father, for his community, and for all those who came after him, because dignity wasn't just something to be won in a single battle, it was something to be earned, protected, and passed on, and Malcolm was ready to carry that torch as far as it needed to go. 7. They were used to confrontation, to suspects who either complied out of fear or resisted in anger, but this was different. Malcolm wasn't pleading for mercy, nor was he lashing out in rage. Instead, he was standing firm, demanding respect, demanding dignity. For a moment, the officer's hand hovered over his weapon, his expression caught between indecision and frustration. He had power, authority, but in Malcolm's unwavering stare, he felt a sudden vulnerability, a fracture in the control he thought he had. "Stand down," a voice cut through the tension. From behind them, more officers had arrived. "Back up," Malcolm assumed. They emerged from their cars, weapons drawn, but it was clear from the shift in their posture that they hadn't expected to walk into this kind of scene. A supervisor, a tall, graying man with a hardened face, stepped between Malcolm and the two officers. "What's going on here?" the supervisor barked, eyeing the situation with sharp scrutiny. His tone was all business, but the subtle concern behind it didn't escape Malcolm. "He ran," the younger officer explained, clearly on edge, trying to regain his composure. "We had to pursue. He resisted." "I didn't resist," Malcolm interrupted, his voice calmer now. He locked eyes with the supervisor, his chest still heaving but his words deliberate. "I ran because I was afraid. But I didn't resist. I just want to go home." The supervisor glanced between the officers and Malcolm, his frown deepening as he took in the scene. Malcolm, bleeding and battered but still upright, still defiant, the two officers, tense and defensive, their weapons still in hand. The air was thick with the weight of unspoken truths. After what felt like an eternity, the supervisor made his decision. "Lower your weapons," he ordered the two officers, his voice firm. "But sir," I said, "lower your weapons." There was no room for argument in his tone. Reluctantly, the officers holstered their guns, their faces still tight with unresolved tension. The supervisor turned to Malcolm, his gaze softening just a fraction. "Let's get you medical attention. You're hurt." Malcolm shook his head, the adrenaline still coursing through his veins. "I don't need your help. I just want to go home." "You're bleeding, son," the supervisor said, more gently this time, gesturing to the deep gash on Malcolm's leg. Malcolm looked down at his injury, feeling the sting intensify now that the surge of the chase had passed. Blood soaked his torn jeans, the wound ugly and raw. But he wasn't ready to back down yet. Not after everything. "I've had worse," he muttered, though his voice betrayed a hint of weariness. His body was beginning to catch up to the pain, and the fight within him, while still burning strong, was starting to feel like an enormous weight. The supervisor sighed, clearly recognizing that Malcolm was no ordinary suspect. There was no winning here by force. Instead, he crouched slightly, making his voice more personal, as if trying to bridge the gulf between them. "I don't know what happened here tonight, but I don't want to see anyone else get hurt. Let us help you." The world seemed to slow again, and for the first time, Malcolm saw an opportunity to stand down without feeling like he was giving up. This wasn't just about survival anymore, it was about living with dignity. He nodded, finally allowing the weight of the situation to settle in. "All right," he said, exhaustion evident in his voice. "But I'm not your suspect." "You're wrong." The supervisor nodded, signaling to one of the paramedics who had just arrived. As they began to tend to Malcolm's wounds, a small crowd started to form at the edge of the scene. Neighbors, witnesses, people who had seen the chase unfold, stood watching in silence. Malcolm noticed them out of the corner of his eye, their expressions a mixture of concern and curiosity. The paramedic worked quickly, wrapping his leg and checking his other injuries. As they did, Malcolm's mind began to clear, the events of the night replaying over and over. How quickly everything had escalated. How easily his life could have ended on that street. As the pain in his leg dulled, his thoughts turned to what would come next. He had stood up for himself, demanded his dignity, but he knew this wasn't the end of the story. There would be questions, investigations, maybe even court hearings. But he had survived, not just physically, but emotionally, spiritually. He hadn't allowed them to break him. Part 7. Aftermath. In the days that followed, the story of Malcolm's confrontation with the police spread. Neighbors shared their accounts of the night, some speaking to reporters, others posting videos of the incident online. The media picked up the story, framing it as yet another instance of racial profiling and police brutality. Malcolm's name was now in headlines, discussed on talk shows, debated in newsrooms. He became a symbol, not just of survival, but of resistance. But for Malcolm, the fight wasn't over. As the days turned into weeks, he found himself at the center of legal proceedings. Civil rights lawyers reached out, eager to represent him in what they saw as a potential landmark case. Malcolm was torn. He had never wanted to be a symbol or a hero. All he had wanted was to go home, yet, he couldn't ignore the larger implications of what had happened. This wasn't just about him anymore, it was about the countless others who had been in his position, who hadn't been so lucky to walk away. And so, reluctantly, Malcolm agreed to let the lawyers take his case forward. The lawsuit against the police department was filed within a month. The charges: racial profiling, excessive use of force, and violation of civil rights. The officers involved were placed on administrative leave, pending the investigation. The city braced itself for the media storm and the protests that were sure to follow. For Malcolm, the days were long and the nights restless. He couldn't escape the feeling that, despite everything, justice might still elude him. He had lived through this system his entire life, he knew how it worked, how it protected those in power and crushed those without. But something had changed in him. He wasn't the same man he had been before that night. He had found a strength within himself, a voice that refused to be silenced. And that, more than anything, gave him hope. Part 8. Dignity reclaimed. Months passed, and the trial began. The courtroom was packed, reporters and spectators alike eager to see how the case would unfold. Malcolm sat at the plaintiff's table, his leg still healing but his spirit unbroken. His lawyer, a sharp-witted woman with years of civil rights cases under her belt, stood by his side, ready to fight for his justice. The trial was grueling. The defense painted the officers as heroes, men who had acted under pressure, doing their job in dangerous circumstances. They portrayed Malcolm as a suspect who had provoked the situation, who had run instead of complying, who had resisted. But Malcolm's lawyer was relentless. She tore apart the officer's testimony, showing video footage, witness accounts, and the stark reality of the racial profiling that had taken place that night. Slowly, the truth came to light. The system that had tried to crush Malcolm was now being held to account after weeks of testimony, cross-examinations, and media frenzy. The jury deliberated. The courtroom was silent as the foreman stood to deliver the verdict. Malcolm held his breath. Guilty. The words rang out, echoing in the courtroom. A wave of relief washed over Malcolm, but it was tempered by the knowledge that this was just one battle in a much larger war. As he stepped outside the courthouse, the bright sun shining down on him, Malcolm felt the weight of the world lift from his shoulders, if only for a moment. He had fought for his dignity, and he had won. But the fight for justice, for equality, was far from over. In the distance, he could hear the chants of protesters, see the signs demanding change. And for the first time in a long time, Malcolm felt hope, because now, he wasn't fighting alone. Epilogue, a new beginning. The months following the trial were a whirlwind. Malcolm's story had ignited a fire in the community, sparking conversations about systemic racism, police reform, and the value of human dignity. He was asked to speak at rallies, to share his experience with others who had suffered in silence for far too long. At first, Malcolm was hesitant. He had never wanted to be in the spotlight, never wanted to be the face of a movement. But as he stood before crowds of people, all of them looking to him for strength and guidance, he realized that this was his path now. He had been given a voice, not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever been silenced, and so, Malcolm spoke. He shared his story, his pain, his resilience. He spoke of the night he had almost lost everything, and the fight he had waged to reclaim his dignity. And in doing so, he gave others the courage to do the same. The world didn't change overnight. There were still battles to be fought, still injustices to be corrected. But Malcolm knew that as long as people were willing to stand up, to demand their dignity, there was hope. And for the first time in his life, Malcolm allowed himself to believe in that hope, because he had fought for his life, and won.